Mr. John Vorster is Prime Minister of South Africa and has been since in September 1966. A deranged assassin plunged a knife into the heart of his predecessor, Hendrik Verwoerd, the sociology professor who, although he did not found the policy of apartheid, did his best to elaborate it as the modus operandi for South Africa. John Vorster had been Minister of Justice before his accession, and it was widely supposed that he would rigorously, not to say ferociously, continue the policies of separate development, as it is called here. To the surprise of many, he proved to be not only a man of resolute will, but of unpredictable resilience, with the result that which a dozen years ago was thought to be unthinkable in South Africa is in many places the rule, which is not to say that apartheid has been in any substantial sense abandoned. Mr. Vorster's political party, the Nationalists, are expected to repeat their periodic victory at the polls a few days from now, and they are running on the usual ticket. Balthazar Johannes Vorster was born the 13th child of an Afrikaner sheep farmer in 1915. He went to the University of Stellenbosch and got a law degree. During the war, he was interned for anti-British sentiments. After the war, he practiced law and ran for Parliament, finally achieving election in 1953. He was a strong backer of Prime Minister Sturgeon, and then of his old sociology teacher, Mr. Verwoerd, who made him Minister of Justice. I should like to begin by asking the Prime Minister whether, as almost every account of his background in America and elsewhere notes, he was in fact, during the war, pro-Nazi.
No, I can definitely say that it wasn't a question of being pro-Nazi. As a matter of fact, the official reasons for my internment didn't even mention it. It was stated that I was anti-British, and that in my own country.
So that, in fact, to deduce from that you were pro-Nazi would be as incorrect as to deduce that we were pro-communist because we were on the side of Stalin.
Quite.
So there's no aspect of the National Socialist ideology that has ever appealed to you?
No, not even my worst enemies at the time could accuse me of being that. I was pro-Afrikaans.
Right. And your feeling was that participation in that war did not inure to the benefit of the Afrikaans?
I believed, as the late General Herzog believed, as the late Dr. Milan and all the other leaders of the National Party believed, and as you initially believed, in neutrality in that war.
The neutrality that you backed then differs, does it not, from your policies today, in which you do feel a solidarity with the anti-communist states?
As far as we are concerned, we feel that we are part and parcel of the free world, or the Western world, call it what you will.
So that you would be willing, if the circumstances should ever require it, to participate in a joint effort?
If, in the event of a communist war, as against the free world, we are called upon to do our share, we will certainly do it.
Now, your mention of the word, the term free world, brings up, of course, the indictment of South Africa as it is most generally ventilated in America and the United Nations, in other parts of the, quote, free world. What they say, of course, is that there is no substantial freedom in South Africa unless it happens that your skin is white. Now, the doctrine of separate development is not, I think, widely understood in America, and I wonder if you could briefly sketch how it is that you consider it to be compatible with general freedom.
Yes, I take it what you do mean, in fact, maybe you were too polite to say it, that it is said that we are, in fact, a police state.
It's certainly said, certainly, yeah.
If that is the case, then it's the only police state that I know of where you must do your level best to keep people out. Because as it happens at the moment, we have thousands and thousands of illegal black immigrants in this country, and we can't get them out, and they come in if given half a chance.
Well,
and again, as far as the police state story is concerned, you've been in this country before, I think, and you are here now, and you need just to read our newspapers to see that there is more criticism of the government in this country than probably in any comparable country.
yes, and we may as well touch on that now. It is not widely known that there is very severe press criticism, but it is also has been remarked that as recently as a few months ago, you threatened to close down certain newspapers in the event that they should write, that they should publish copy which, quotes, would lead to an explosive situation among the various races. So it's not an absolute freedom then?
Naturally, in our situation, I think each and every man who has the future of this country at heart will agree with me that the one thing we should avoid is to incite one race against another. And racial incitement, not only in South Africa, has always been an offense. It is also an offense in Canada and many other countries that I know of.
And under the Genocide Treaty of the United Nations, it also is.
I'm not so conversant with that aspect, but now that you mention it, that is so.
Well, would you give me an example of something which would not be permitted to be said in the press so that we could have an idea of where you draw the line?
No, if one race is incited to act violently, to put it mildly, against another race, then certainly the government of the day must be entitled to take steps against it.
Well, suppose we reason a posteriori and ask you this. Have you in fact closed down any newspapers?
No.
So therefore this is simply a directive of sorts.
No, it was a timely warning.
A timely warning. But,
and whilst on the subject of newspapers, again, may I just remind you that it so happens that for each one newspaper supporting the cause of my government and my party, there are at least 10 who are violently against my party and its policies.
But not so violently as to cause an explosive situation?
Not at this stage, but I must watch the future.
Yes. Well, now, you're saying that, you cannot justifiably call a state a police state into which people immigrate. Doesn't, of course...
And where you have free elections, as we have periodic free elections.
For white people?
For white people, and elections for the other peoples in their own countries.
Well, now, the policy of separate development, as I understand it, has at this point evolved, roughly speaking, as follows, that about 14% of South Africa is reserved for the Bantustans.
It's not a question of being reserved for them. That is where the mistake is made all along the line. To interpret this situation, you must know something of the history.
Yes, I wish you'd tell us something about
this country and its people. It so happens that more or less, for all practical purposes, the time that the whites moved up from the Cape, the blacks moved down from the middle of Africa, and they settled certain portions of what is now the Republic of South Africa. The Xhosas settled the Transkei, the Zulus settled portions of Natal, the Tswanas settled portions of Western Transvaal, the Sothos settled portions of Northern Transvaal, the Vendas settled another portion of Northern Transvaal, and so I can go on. And they claimed certain land which to this day they still possess. So it wasn't a question that it was reserved for them. They settled that land and they've got it to this very day. But apart from that, and the whites settled the rest. But apart from the land that they initially settled, and which today is still their land, in 1936, the then United Party, under the leadership of General Herzog as Prime Minister and General Smuts as Deputy Prime Minister, they passed a law that saying that in addition to that land which the black peoples originally settled, the whites at their expense should add 7.25 million morgan of land. And that land is still being bought up today. As a matter of fact, about a little over 6 million morgan of the 7.25 has already been bought, and we are now buying up the last remaining 1.25 million of morgan of land.
So your point is that historically, that land which is theirs continues to be theirs.
Continues to be theirs, and we didn't put them there and say to them, look, that is where you must live. They settled that land, and they picked that land, and let me say so, from an agricultural point of view and from a rainfall point of view, it is the best land in South Africa.
Well, but it is true that I think the figure is 2 million people have actually been moved, correct, during the past 15 years, told to go other than where they would like to be.
No, it's not only black people that have been moved. Whites are being moved as well. I've just tried to explain to you that whites have to evacuate no less than 7.25 million morgan of land. And blacks are put on that land.
Well, essentially...
Well-developed farms and well-developed land.
Well, essentially, as I understand it, you view the situation in South Africa roughly as follows, that the black population are your guests, that they actually belong in the ancient territories. To the extent that they live and work in your territories, they must accept that they are not first-class citizens.
You can more or less equate them to the guest workers in Europe. Because it's not only the black workers from Tswana land or Venda land or Zulu land that come to work in South Africa. Independent, the citizens of independent African countries come to South Africa to look for work for the simple reason that their own countries can't employ them. You have more or less 90,000 Malawians working in this country. And if we were to say to Malawi tomorrow, and we've never had anything to do with Malawi whatsoever, it's a country, as you know, situated far away from us. If we were to say to them tomorrow, I'm awfully sorry, I can't accommodate your people any longer, you must take them back, their economy will be very, very seriously hurt. The same applies to Lesotho, an independent country, member of UNO. If we were to say to Lesotho, we are sorry, we can't employ their 105,000 people working in this country at the moment, you can well imagine what will happen to the economy of Lesotho. Well, the same applies to Botswana, and the same applies to Swaziland, and the same applies to any other of the African countries who come to South Africa to look for work.
Well, but Mr. Vorster, what you are saying is either a commentary on the paradise of South Africa or on the misery of the countries they flee from.
No, it's not a question of misery either, or a paradise either for this matter. It is simply that as far as the whole of Africa is concerned, it's got a backlog in development. To understand that, again, one must look at their history. But the point is, and I'm not saying it in a derogatory sense at all, but for generations to come, on account of the fact that they multiply by over 3%, as compared with ours of little over 1%. For generations to come, their difficulty will consequently be that they cannot create sufficient avenues of employment. And therefore, for generations to come, and I want to make it very clear that I'm not saying it in a derogatory sense at all, but in a practical, realistic sense, their main export will be labor, because they can't employ their own people. And it so happens that until that time, that they have developed to such an extent that they can employ their own people, they will be forced to look to South Africa and other countries to employ their people whom they cannot employ themselves.
Now, the employment conditions in South Africa have been severely criticized because of the extraordinary disparity in the revenue earned by a white person as distinguished from a black person. The last estimate I saw of that was 12 to 1. Now, is this a policy of conscious exploitation, or is this because there is a superabundance of labor and therefore you try to pay it as little as possible?
No, it's a question of the stage of development that people have reached. Whilst you are on that subject, I don't suppose you'll mind if I tell you this, that according to your own figures, published by the Americans themselves, Dr. Munger made use of the figures some time ago. The average rate of pay of American firms in this country to certain categories of workers, the average rate is $140 for the same category of work. In Brazil, you pay 66. And for the same category in India, American firms pay 33. But nobody worries about India, nobody worries about Brazil. But South Africa, being the whipping boy, apparently must feel it on her back.
Well, I see your point, but I think that what people in America would comment on that is that it is one thing to pay all Brazilians $66 a month. It would be another thing to come to Africa and pay $50 a month to a black man and $500 a month to a white man.
Again, that argument is not true, because there are thousands of blacks and coloreds in this country who, in fact, earn more than whites. It's not a question that there is a minimum pay for whites and a maximum pay for non-whites. You take our industrial legislation. Our industrial legislation says specifically that there must be no discrimination as between white and non-white when pay is fixed for certain categories of work. But naturally, it stands to reason that you don't pay an unschooled man the same salary as a highly skilled man.
So you're saying there are no disparities?
I use the word unschooled. Unskilled, of course, is the word, not
sure,
unschooled.
Sure. But so you're saying there are no disparities in the income that is earned in the practice of an identical job?
No. A white fitter and turner earns exactly the same wage as a colored fitter and turner. Or a white mechanic earns exactly the same as a non-white mechanic. The Industrial Conciliation Act provides that. There are, in other words, I want to get this very clear. There are no maximum wages for non-whites and minimum wages for whites. There are minimum wages for all categories, white or non-white. And as far as maximum is concerned, it depends entirely upon the employer.
Now, the South African Department of Statistics reported in October of 1973 total monthly earnings for the 400,000 white workers in your three major industries at 203 million rand, and the total for 1,847,000 black workers at 145 million rand.
Yes,
now, this reflects only the difference in the level of skill.
It's a question of skilled workers as against unskilled workers.
Now, it is nevertheless correct, is it not, that there were illegal strikes in the Durban area early this year, which you winked at, that is to say you didn't prosecute the strikers, followed by a very sharp increase in wages and a 50% increase in wages for the gold workers in the last 18 months. Is this a recognition of the need, or is it an economic development?
No, it's an economic development, and it has been going on throughout the years. And incidentally, I won't even call it a strike, I'll call it a stoppage of 2-3 days. Because in actual fact, the last general strike we had in this country was in 1922. Our people don't know what a strike looks like.
Well, the plight of the African black, then, so far as I can understand it, is is a plight that, as you would put it, evolves from the fact that he's a guest in your country, just as though he were a Malawian or what have you. And under the circumstances, he is bound to follow rules that are made for a white society. Now, when you talk about the Industrial Reconciliation Act, is that something that replaced the Job Reservation Act?
No, the Industrial Reconciliation Act is an old act. It's been on the statute book since the 20s.
Mm-hmm. Well,
and as far as the so-called job reservation is concerned, it deals with less than 3% of all the workers. But it is a question of protecting certain workers who cannot do anything else but that particular work.
Well, when I was in Durban a dozen years ago, if you wanted to drive a taxi, you had to be a white man. Is that also the case now?
No, there are taxis owned and driven by whites, there are taxis owned and driven by coloreds, and there are taxis owned and driven by blacks.
So that there has been improvement on that particular point?
As far as I know, that has always been the case. It might have been just different in Durban, but in Cape Town, as far as I know, it has always been the case.
Well, what jobs are excluded to blacks? You say only 3%. Would you give me a description of a job that a black may not hold?
No, candidly, it's not a question that he cannot hold that particular job. It's a question that the whites who are holding that particular job, because they can do nothing else, are protected in that job. But I can't think of any practical example just at the moment. Because, as I've told you, it refers to less than 3% of all workers.
Well, if I were a factory manager in South Africa, would I be permitted to fire a lazy white man and hire an industrious black man to fill his shoes?
In general, yes.
And we say in general, yes. What would be the exceptions?
No, I can't think of any exceptions at the moment.
Well, in discussing, before we move on to a couple of other matters, in discussing the business of the police state, what seems especially offensive in, for instance, America, is your right to quote, ban. Now, as I understand it, ban is a word that is used here for putting somebody in house arrest, forbidding him from any kind of communication with other banned people, forbidding him from publishing any of his works. This was recently done to a dozen student leaders, black and white. Is that correct? I know you were once the victim of that kind of treatment, but I know also that it was resented then in your behalf, and presumably is resented now in behalf of the students.
No, in 1950, the Anti-Communist Act was passed, and if a man, in terms of that act, is found to work and speak in favor of communism, then the Minister of Justice, after having received a report from judicial officers specified in that act, can place certain restrictions on the movement of such a person, can prohibit him from addressing meetings, and if he is prohibited from addressing meetings, whatever he says cannot be published by newspapers.
And is there a judicial appeal against that finding?
He has an appeal to the minister, but then if he feels that he has a case, he can go to the Supreme Court, as people have often gone.
And what would he plead? A factual or juridical case?
He will, if his case is that...
all he has to prove is that he's not a communist, that's all?
If he can prove that he's not a communist, and therefore that the minister has acted against him mala fide, then naturally the Supreme Court has the right to set aside the...
Has it ever happened?
I don't know of a single instance where the Supreme Court has found that the action of the minister was mala fide.
Wouldn't that suggest that you have a highly tame Supreme Court, or simply a very high level of accuracy?
No, I think the last accusation that any man can make against South Africa is that we have a tame Supreme Court, for the simple reason that our courts have a reputation that they will give judgment according to their conscience at all times. And what is more, people in this country, the judges, are not appointed because they belong to a certain political party or to the political party of the government. As a matter of fact, in my time as Minister of Justice, I appointed probably far more judges who belonged to the opposition party than to my own party.
Well, but the Supreme Court has only that authority which is vested in it by the Parliament, which you dominate, correct?
Naturally,
there is no Bill of Rights.
The Supreme Court must interpret the law.
Yeah, but there is
that is the only legal system that I think that works in public.
Well, we've got a different one in America. We have a constitution that you can appeal to.
I don't think we must get involved in an argument about your legal system and ours.
No, I don't want to.
Because I think you'll get off second best.
Well, that's conceivable.
Be that as it may, this
likely,
isn't the purpose of our interview.
No, sure. But what I'm saying is this. If the Parliament says we vest in the Prime Minister the exclusive right in his own sole judgment or in the Minister of Justice to decide that a particular person is a, quote, communist and under the circumstances not entitled to his civil rights, then there's nothing the Supreme Court can do about it. If you have the exclusive right, unless it is shown that you were bribed into exercising that petulantly or without reference to the factual situation, what can the Supreme Court do to help this person?
No, but surely if a man acted in such a way that no one in his sound and sober senses can say that he has been furthering the aims and objects of communism, it's the easiest thing in the world to prove that there must be malafide on the part of the minister.
Well, it may be easy, but it's never been done.
Yeah, because I make bold to say that we've only acted against people who needed acting against.
Will you say nobody in his right mind? Would you say that Alan Paton is in his right mind? Because he has written that
no, I don't want to discuss personalities, but I think Alan Paton knows very little about this at all, and he wasn't acted against.
He was what?
He wasn't acted against.
No, but he wrote an article describing the activities of 8 student leaders who were banned, and it was not possible, for me in any case, to see wherein it could be said about them that they were, quote, communists.
But what did he know of the facts?
Well...
What did he know about the investigation? It's so easy just to say. But surely, if you've made a study of the facts, then it's something quite different.
Well, do you publish the facts?
A man is entitled to ask for reasons why he is banned, and those reasons are given to him.
And how factually are those reasons elaborated? There's no trial, there's no jury.
No, it's administrative action agreed.
Yeah. Do you know of any other, quote, free country that gives to the Minister of Justice any equivalent power? In England, Germany,
it depends
France,
entirely on the circumstances.
Does
For
it?
instance, when you had this upflare in Canada, Canada went very much further than South Africa has ever gone.
Yeah, but they invoked a specific piece of legislation, the War Emergency Act.
Yes,
and kept
to
it
deal
in,
with that particular emergency.
Yeah, and then it lapsed.
And
but yours is a continuing situation.
Yes.
Why?
Because we have this communist threat in this part of the world. We had it in the 40s, we had it in the 50s, we had it in the 60s. And as far as we are concerned, we must be constantly on our guard.
May I ask you this, Mr. Prime Minister, do you use the word communist as a metaphor, or do you use it exactly?
No, exactly.
I happen to be very, very much in agreement with you that there is a communist threat of disruption, but I also think that some people find it a lot easier to classify as, quote, communist.
No, I'm not.
That which they don't agree with.
I'm not the type of man who sees a communist under every bed. But what I do know, because I was Minister of Justice since 1961, that an attempt was in fact made by the communists to overthrow this government by sabotage and violence. And these people were brought before the courts, and they were sentenced, some to very long terms of imprisonment.
They might try to overthrow the government by sabotage and violence without being communists, right?
No, but in actual fact, they were communists.
You mean their convictions were that they wanted to create a workers' state subsidiary to the domination of the Soviet Union, so on, the whole bit?
They shouted it from the rooftops. As a matter of fact, in the 50s, the communists shouted it from the rooftops that they were going to take over this country in 1963. And they still haven't abandoned that idea that ultimately the communists will take over this country for the simple reason that they want to control the tip of South Africa so that they can control the Cape Sea route, which is the lifeline of Europe.
About 4 or 5 months ago, I, as a United States delegate to the United Nations, pushed a button voting on the South African side of a particular issue. The vote was 103 to 4. We were one of the 4. We were on your side on that particular issue. Now, of those 103 who voted against you, only about 14 or 15 were communist powers. Nevertheless, some 50 or 60 or 70 countries in the world desired to strip South Africa of its credentials on the grounds that you were committing a, quote, crime against humanity. Now, leaving for a moment completely aside whether this is a correct way to describe South African policy, I do ask you this. How can you say that it is exclusively the communists who are thus energized to vote against South Africa?
No, I distinctly told you it's the communists who, in fact, want to take over this country.
Yeah. Well, so therefore that would not, in your opinion, be related to the United Nations vote?
No, that is a different matter. That is probably, don't know to which particular instance you are referring, but the background of all this is that there are many countries in the world, and mainly for that reason they vote against us, are annoyed with us because we haven't got the system of one man, one vote as far as the whole republic is concerned, and they won't accept the policy of separate development, which means that there is in fact a white state in South Africa and 8 black states consisting of different peoples with their own language, their own customs, their own traditions, etc., etc.
Well, how do you account for the special animosity against South Africa? Is it a lack of understanding, in your opinion? And if so, why haven't you more successfully made your case understandable? Or is it a hostility that arises from the relative economic success of South Africa?
Well, let me explain it to you this way. This government, with its policy of separate development, came into power in May 1948. Prior to that, General Smuts, who was an international
hero,
to use your words, he led this country, and he experienced the very same thing that you know, that we are experiencing today. The difference was, however, this, that there were only 3 independent black countries represented in UNO at that time. And in spite of that, and in spite of the fact that he had an international reputation, he came back in 46, in 47, and 48 to the parliament of this country to say that people wouldn't listen to him, that it wasn't possible to talk to them because the whole issue was so emotionally clouded, as he put it. Well, so it's not a question of only this government, it's a question that that was the attitude against South Africa right from the very start, in spite of the fact that General Smuts was one of the founder members of UNO and together with 1 or 2 other people wrote the charter.
Well, is it emotionally cloudy as a result of the the main trunk of the apartheid idea, or is it primarily the petty apartheid, what you call here? Petty apartheid, the little indignities that black
petty
people
apartheid
suffer.
wasn't even known in those days. It's a modern invention of my political opponents. Only it was only the word was only coined about 3, 4, 5 years ago.
Well, what do you call it when, let's say, blacks have to go on top of the bus? Is that part of apartheid in general, or is that petty apartheid?
I don't know. You had the same experience in America. You would know better than I.
Well, we called it Jim Crow.
No, that is how we developed in this country. It was customary to do it that way in South Africa.
Well, I'm asking you whether you think it's intrinsic to the idea of apartheid or whether it's expendable. For instance, here in Johannesburg, very recently, they all of a sudden decided that black and white people could sit in the same park bench. Now, that's all of, what, 3 weeks old, that decision? Now, that's what I would call petty apartheid, unless you say that the whole trunk of the apartheid thing is fragmenting as a result of that dispensation.
No, the whole basis of the policy of separate development is to avoid wherever you can friction. Friction as between the various races. Because a country situated as South Africa is concerned, must at all times, if it wants to develop properly and have stable government and good order and peace, must go out of its way to avoid friction as much as possible. And where it creates friction, then you keep people apart. Where it doesn't create friction, then you don't do so.
And this is an empirical question, is it?
Yes.
In other words, you wait X number of years, and if white and black people don't start fighting in the park, then you allow them to associate.
No, I've said time and again, and I'm on record as saying on the 14th of September 1966, when I first took over, the basis of the policy of separate development is not that I'm better than the other man.
I didn't say that.
No, I say what I said. I said the basis is not that I think that I'm better. The basis is that there is a difference. And unfortunately, not only in South Africa but the world over, where different peoples meet, you have friction. And as we see it, and as we develop, we do our level best to avoid friction.
So that what we call a petty apartheid here is your way of coping with potential friction.
With potential friction. That is the only basis of it.
Well, now suppose you have black man A and white man B saying that it is, as far as they're concerned, far more provocative to keep them apart than to permit them, for instance, to lunch together at a restaurant. Why is it that your judgment as regards friction is superior to theirs?
No, because it's my duty to maintain law and order.
Yes, but I'm asking you to explain a law that seeks to act in behalf of two individual human beings, respecting a matter over which they are sovereign, namely their feeling for each other.
No, but as I've tried to explain to you, and I think we'll go round and round in circles, you can take it right from the school stage. Blacks have their own schools. Coloreds have their own schools. Indians have their own schools. Whites have their own schools. That is how we develop. We don't even put an Indian and a colored child in the same school as a black child. And from there you can you can argue the whole thing out. And you find in practice the moment that you put Indian and black children in the same school, you have friction leading ultimately to violence. And the same will apply if you put white children and black children in the same school.
You're suggesting that there are no successful multiracial societies, but that isn't true.
I have nothing to do with multiracial societies elsewhere. I must deal with the situation in South Africa as a realist as I find it.
But you're speaking in universals. You say there will be friction. Do you mean there will be friction in the South African context?
Yes.
But you don't mean other parts of the world?
Let us be honest. Those who say that there aren't friction in other parts of the world, well, they're just talking nonsense. Because you and I know that there are, in fact, friction.
Well, sure. There's, I think probably racial animosities are temperamentally the most
you have a handful
obsessive.
Of black people in Britain and you have friction there. You have 10% black people in America. And in spite of the fact that they are Americans, and we'd have
a hell of a lot more friction if we had apartheid.
That I don't know, and I don't want to criticize your way of life at all.
Yeah,
all I am saying is that in spite of the fact that you have a minority of blacks, you have friction. In our case, well, we have to deal with a majority of blacks.
Yeah, well, there's friction in all free societies. In Mozambique, which is not very far from here, there is no apartheid, and there's no obvious friction that I can see. Whites and blacks go to schools together and buses together and so on.
Yes, up to a certain point, because there are very, very few whites there, in fact.
Well, getting back to the United Nations, are you concerned, Mr. Vorster, are you concerned that perhaps at the next session of the General Assembly, they will not only dispute the credentials of your ambassador, but will also refuse to permit him to vote?
I don't want to discuss that at this stage. We will deal with that situation if and when it arises. And I am on record as saying how we will deal
you're
with that
on record
situation.
as saying that the United Nations is a comedy. And I see your point. But
yeah.
In other words, you don't want to discuss contingent arrangements
no.
in the United Nations. Well, let me ask you this, referring not to the future of the United Nations, but to the past of the United Nations. When Mr. Mueller rises to speak in the General Assembly in an effort to explain what is going on here, and two-thirds of the chamber rises and leaves, do you deduce from this that the United Nations is not a forum that is serving the purpose for which it was intended, namely that people should listen to each other?
No, I think the AOU caucus dominates United Nations for that purpose.
That's the African Unity Caucus.
Yes.
And that under the circumstances, the United Nations is more or less their creature at this point.
On this point, certainly.
Yeah. Well, the mounting offensive against Southwest Africa seems to be reaching some sort of a crisis. Would you give the position of South Africa on the finding of the World Court having to do with whether or not you justifiably administer the affairs of Southwest Africa?
Well, it all depends to which finding of the World Court you are referring. If you're referring to the 1966 one, then I'm with you. If you refer to the later one, then I'm not with you.
Then you're not with what?
Then I don't agree with you that the last decision can bind South Africa in any way. Britain doesn't accept it either, for that matter, and France doesn't accept it.
So that you take the legal position that your right to administer that part of the world has not in fact been impeached.
Will you just repeat that?
I say you take the position that you still have a legal right to administer the affairs of Southwest Africa.
Naturally.
Well, is it correct that you have in mind a Bantustan within Southwest Africa, which would comprehend the most populated area, that you will try to do in Southwest Africa what you have done here?
There again, in Southwest Africa, it wasn't a question of us putting the Ovambos where they are, and they are the majority. They are about 45% of the people of Southwest Africa. We didn't put them there where they are at the moment. That is the part of the world which they originally settled and where they've lived and where no white man owns land or can own land for that matter.
You mean dating back to when? Dating back to when South Africa was given by the League the mandate, or even before then?
Long before the Germans occupied Southwest Africa, that was the position.
Looking now to the strategic situation in South Africa, it is clear, for instance, from the events here in Johannesburg in the last few days, that that the territory of South Africa is being challenged by terrorists, even as in Rhodesia and in Mozambique. Is it your feeling that that pressure will continue, or that it is abating?
No, it will continue.
And do you consider that?
As long as the Red Chinese and the Russians are willing to provide arms for communist-led and communist-trained terrorists, so long we will be faced with this threat.
But it's not just the Red Chinese and the Russians, is it? I mean, even the Dutch collect money and send it to...
Yes, piously saying that it is for non-military purposes.
Yeah. Well, the fact is that it is not only the communist countries that are raising money for terrorist activities.
No, there are other do-gooder countries who do the same.
Yeah. Now, is it a situation that mounts a serious military challenge for South Africa at any point in the future?
Not at this stage, but naturally if it escalates, and we must be on our guard all the time. In this connection, it can be serious. But at this stage, it is initially a threat to Rhodesia, it's a threat to Angola, and it's a threat to Mozambique.
Under what circumstances, if any, would you feel that you needed to render assistance to Rhodesia?
We have stated all along, and I'm on record as saying that as far as we are concerned, terrorism is such a scourge that we will come to the aid of any government who requests our help in this regard.
Has Rhodesia requested your help?
Our police are there on the Rhodesian borders, have been there for years and years.
Well, on the southern border or the northern border?
No, on the Rhodesian side.
On the Rhodesian side. Mm-hmm.
Because the Rhodesians have never crossed the border into Zambia or any other country. They are just guarding their borders as they are entitled. And we are helping them in that regard.
Well, now, what have been the casualties in South Africa from terrorism in the last couple of years, and have they increased?
15 or 17 of our policemen have been killed in the last 2 years on the borders. 4 were killed just a few days ago, unfortunately.
And were there assassins detected?
No, it is a question of hit and run. They come across the border, hit and then run back.
Is it known that they were not South Africans? Were they in fact foreigners?
Yes.
Has there been, so far as you are aware, any collusion between black South Africans and terrorists who come in from the north?
Talking about South African blacks now?
Yes.
No.
So that there is nothing
As
here.
far as the black leaders of South Africa is concerned, they are just as violently anti-terrorist as I am.
Well, how many people have you had during your administration as Prime Minister to exile or ban for political activity?
No, good heavens, I'm not a walking encyclopedia to
Approximately.
remember that.
I mean, is it in the hundreds or the dozens or the thousands?
No, as you very well know, I was Minister of Justice up to 1966, and I can't remember back to those days. I'll mislead you if I give you any figure. They were not...
Are the figures public, or are they concealed?
No, you can find that. It's published it has to be published in the Government Gazette.
And what are the classifications for dealing with politically intolerable people? Do you have the authority to exile them?
Exile them where?
Wherever they would be accepted?
No, I have no authority to send people outside the country if they were born here.
And so therefore, the only penalty that is available
if they leave this country, they leave the country of their own free will, but I can't force them to leave.
So that is not one of your
no,
one of your sanctions.
We've never forced anybody, and we haven't got the power to force them out. And we've never asked for that power because, in any event, if the country on the other side isn't willing to accept the man, what is the use of having such power?
Well, presumably that's not a problem. I mean, if you find a country that is willing to accept somebody who is exiled, then that settles the problem of where he will live.
No, but we haven't got that power, and we've never asked for it.
Yeah. Now, has there been, as these pressures mount from these terrorists, has there been a corresponding increase in politically intolerable activity in South Africa?
No, I don't.
There's no liaison that you
I
can
don't
see.
think at this stage. Naturally, there are those people inside the country who have said to themselves in the past that as the threat from outside mounts, so our activity must increase in the country.
But it hasn't happened.
To a certain limited extent, yes, but I'm not prepared to put it higher than that at this stage. But it is a thing about which you must be on your guard at all times.
Yeah. We have only a few minutes left, Mr. Vorster. I'd like to ask your views on a historical question. Most of the rhetoric that one hears in the United Nations is really almost is Wilsonian in origin: democracy, self-rule, and so on. It is, however, the experience in most countries in Africa that having achieved, quote, self-rule, they do not go on from there to a parliamentary democracy. Is it your judgment that this is an African phenomenon, or is it your judgment that it is a Wilsonian heresy that transcends the aches and pains of the 20th century?
No, I think it's a mistake to transplant Westminster democracy to Africa. The whole concept is foreign to Africa.
Therefore, you think that the kind of governments that prevail in Africa are culturally natural.
Yes.
And under the circumstances, you would not be sympathetic with dissidents in an African country who call, say, for an increase in parliamentary democracy.
I don't think you will ever, in the rest of Africa, have parliamentary democracy in the sense that you have it in South Africa, Britain, or America.
And the reason is what?
I think it's inherent in their system.
When you say their system, you have in mind what? The tribal allegiances,
yes,
that kind of thing? The fact that they didn't have elections in the tribes makes it unlikely that they should think of
in
elections.
Africa, in black Africa, you don't brook opposition. And consequently, you don't give the opposition party the chance to become the reigning party unless it does so by force.
Well, isn't it, however, true that the expression of the members of a tribe has a way of making itself felt on the determinations of the chief?
Yes. They hold kotlas and they hold their indabas, and then they come to a decision.
Which is binding?
Which is binding, yes.
And have you attempted to shape in any way the internal workings of the Bantustans, or have you permitted them?
It is for that very reason that as far as the elected councils of the Bantus in South Africa are concerned, that we've brought in the elected element of the people and the hereditary chiefs, put them in the same council.
But having done that, did you specify procedures or not?
No, the procedures are laid down in the various acts. And they, of course, are entitled to amend the procedure.
Without your supervision?
In certain cases, they require, up to this stage, require the consent of my parliament, but in other cases, they don't.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prime Minister.